The smell of her perfume hit me before I even opened the door. It was a scent I'd known for years, something warm and familiar, but tonight it felt out of place, hanging thick in the air like a warning. I wasn't supposed to be home this early. Choir practice usually ran late, but a sudden cancellation meant I'd have an evening to relax, maybe even surprise Laura with dinner. Instead, as I turned the key in the lock, my heart beat faster, not with excitement, but with a growing sense of unease. The first thing I noticed was the music, something slow and sultry, a far cry from the upbeat tunes we usually had playing in the house. I frowned, kicking off my shoes, the soft strains of a guitar filtering down the hallway. The sound led me to the living room, and that's when I saw them. Laura was on the couch, her back to me, but I recognized the silhouette beside her immediately. Jason Hale. He was a name everyone knew, a face splashed across magazine covers, a voice that filled stadiums. But here in my living room he was just a man, leaning in too close to my wife. For a moment I couldn't move, my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Laura's laughter cut through the haze, a sound that once brought me joy now twisting like a knife in my gut. She turned slightly and I caught the look in her eyes, something soft, something intimate, and it wasn't meant for me. The blood pounded in my ears and suddenly I was in the room, no longer an invisible observer but a storm breaking through. What the hell is going on here? Laura froze, her eyes wide with shock, but Jason was quicker to recover, casually leaning back as if I'd walked in on a friendly chat. Tim, right? He said, his voice smooth, unbothered. Laura's told me a lot about you. My gaze snapped to Laura, searching her face for some explanation, some sign that this was a terrible mistake. But all I saw was guilt, raw and undeniable. Tim, she started, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. I didn't need to hear it. The scene in front of me said it all. The way her hand lingered on his arm, the flush in her cheeks. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. This was something deeper, something that had been going on behind my back. I think you should leave, I said to Jason, my voice trembling with the effort to keep it steady. He didn't argue, just shrugged and stood, flashing Laura a look that made my stomach turn. He sauntered past me, the faint smell of his cologne mingling with Laura's perfume. See you around, he tossed over his shoulder as if we were nothing more than acquaintances. As the door clicked shut behind him, I turned to Laura, who was still sitting on the couch, her eyes downcast. How long? I asked, the words barely audible, even to myself. Tim, I'm so sorry, she whispered, finally looking up at me. It wasn't supposed to be like this. How long? I repeated, my voice stronger now, demanding the truth. A few months, she admitted, tears welling up in her eyes. But it didn't mean anything, I swear. I didn't want to hurt you. I let out a bitter laugh, the sound foreign to my own ears. Didn't mean anything? Laura, you're my wife. How could you throw everything away like this? She tried to reach for me, but I stepped back, the distance between us feeling like a chasm. Tim, please let me explain. But I didn't want to hear it. The pain was too fresh, too raw. I need to get out of here, I said, turning away and grabbing my keys from the table by the door. Tim, wait, she called after me, but I was already out the door, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I got into the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. My mind was a whirl of emotions, anger, betrayal, disbelief, but more than anything, there was a crushing sadness, a weight in my chest that I didn't know how to bear. As I drove aimlessly through the dark streets, the image of them together played over and over in my mind. Laura's laugh, Jason's smirk, the way they seemed so at ease with each other. It felt like my whole world had been upended in a matter of minutes, and I didn't know how to put it back together. I pulled over to the side of the road, the reality of what had just happened hitting me like a freight train. Laura, the woman I'd loved and trusted for years, had betrayed me, and not just with anyone, with Jason Hale, a man whose life was so far removed from ours that it seemed almost surreal. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. I cried for the life I thought I had, for the marriage I thought was strong, for the trust that had been shattered, and at that moment, as the city lights blurred through my tears, I made a vow to myself. Things were going to change. I was going to change, and it started now. The days after the confrontation were a blur. I packed a bag and stayed with a friend, avoiding Laura's calls and texts. Each time her name lit up my phone, it felt like another knife twisting in my chest. I knew I couldn't keep running forever, but I wasn't ready to face her, or the reality of our broken marriage. Instead, I threw myself into anything that could distract me. Work, gym, even mindless TV, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to that night. But nothing worked. Every quiet moment was an invitation for the memories to flood in, and the pain felt just as fresh as the day I'd walked in on them. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I found myself flipping through channels, searching for something, anything, to numb the ache. That's when I stumbled upon a cooking show. Normally I would have kept going, but something about the way the chef was passionately explaining the art of making the perfect risotto caught my attention. I wasn't much of a cook. Laura had always been the one who handled meals, and I was happy to play the role of appreciative husband. But as I watched the chef on the screen, something clicked. Here was a man who had complete control over his world. Every ingredient and every movement had a purpose. There was a precision to it, a kind of artistry that I hadn't noticed before. The next day, I found myself wandering through a local bookstore. I wasn't sure what I was looking for until I saw the section on culinary arts. I picked up a book on basic cooking techniques and spent the rest of the day devouring it, the pages providing a welcome escape from my thoughts. Cooking became my new obsession. I started simple, following recipes to the letter, measuring every ingredient with the care of a surgeon. There was something therapeutic about it, the way I could lose myself in the rhythm of chopping, stirring, and tasting. The kitchen became my sanctuary, a place where I could block out the rest of the world. It wasn't long before I began experimenting, tweaking recipes, adding my own touches. I found joy in creating something from nothing, in turning raw ingredients into a dish that could bring someone comfort or joy. It was a far cry from the life I'd known, but it was something I could control, something I could shape with my own hands. A few months passed and the pain of Laura's betrayal started to dull, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. I enrolled in a culinary course at the local community college, determined to learn everything I could. The classes were intense, but I thrived under the pressure. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was moving forward, building something new. My classmates were a diverse group, some young, fresh out of high school, others like me, looking for a second chance. We bonded over our shared passion, and I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't since the affair. I didn't talk about Laura or Jason. Those wounds were still too raw, but I didn't need to. Cooking was enough. It was healing me in ways I hadn't expected. One night after a particularly grueling class, I found myself sitting alone in the small kitchen I'd set up in my new apartment. I was experimenting with a new dish, something I'd seen in one of my textbooks but wanted to make my own. As I worked, I realized how far I'd come. A few months ago I was broken, lost, and barely able to get out of bed. Now I had something to look forward to, something that gave me a reason to keep going. That night, as I tasted the dish I'd created, a thought struck me. What if I opened a restaurant? The idea seemed crazy at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I wanted to share what I'd discovered, to create a space where others could find the same comfort in food that I had. It would be my way of starting over, of reclaiming my life. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning, research, and meetings with potential investors. I threw myself into the project with the same intensity I'd brought to my cooking. There were obstacles, of course, finding the right location, securing funding, dealing with endless permits, but I tackled each one with a determination that surprised even me. Finally, after months of hard work, my restaurant Harmony was ready to open its doors. The name felt right, a tribute to the life I was building, a balance between the chaos of the past and the peace I was striving for. Opening night was a success beyond my wildest dreams. The restaurant was packed and the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly proud of something I'd accomplished. The satisfaction I got from seeing people enjoy my food was something I hadn't expected, but it filled a void that had been left by Laura's betrayal. As the night wound down and the last guests trickled out, I stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the evening's work. Exhausted but happy, I realized that I was finally starting to heal. The pain was still there, but it was distant now, overshadowed by the new life I was creating. But as I cleaned up and prepared to close the restaurant for the night, a lingering thought gnawed at the back of my mind. Laura and Jason were still out there, their lives untouched by the devastation they'd caused. And while I'd found a way to move forward, a part of me couldn't let go of the anger, the need for closure. Little did I know, that need would soon be tested in ways I could never have imagined. The restaurant was buzzing, every table filled with laughter and conversation. The opening weeks of Harmony had been more successful than I'd dared to hope. Word had spread quickly, and reservations were booked solid for months. The sense of accomplishment kept me going, a warm glow that dulled the lingering pain of betrayal. But tonight, as I moved between tables, greeting guests and checking in with my staff, a familiar voice cut through the noise, freezing me in my tracks. It was a voice I'd tried to forget, a voice that had haunted my dreams even as I built this new life. Jason Hale. I turned slowly, scanning the room until I saw him. He was seated at a corner table, surrounded by a small group of people who looked just as glamorous and polished as he did. His presence dominated the room, the kind of charisma that could command attention without effort. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of shock, anger, and something else, something darker. How dare he show up here, in my sanctuary? The place I'd built to escape the chaos he'd brought into my life. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. This was my restaurant, my domain. I wasn't going to let him ruin it. "Tim, you okay?" One of my waiters, a young guy named Jake, noticed the change in my demeanor. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just a bit of a surprise guest." I watched as Jason laughed at something one of his companions said, completely unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to throw him out, to make a scene and finally confront him for everything he'd done. But another part, a quieter, more calculating part, told me to wait. This could be an opportunity, a way to take back control. I decided to keep my distance, observing from the sidelines as Jason and his entourage enjoyed their meal. But I couldn't just let this go, not after everything I'd been through. I needed to do something, and as I watched him casually sip his wine, an idea began to form. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I went through the motions, smiling and chatting with customers, but my mind was locked on Jason. By the time his table finally cleared out, I'd made up my mind. This was going to be the start of something, a plan that would give me the closure I'd been craving. The next day, I reached out to a contact I'd made through the culinary world, a woman named Carla who specialized in high-end events. I'd met her during the planning stages of Harmony, and she'd been instrumental in helping me secure the right connections to make the restaurant a success. "Carla, I need a favor," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "There's a culinary show coming up, right? The one that Jason Hale is involved with?" "Yes, there is," she replied, a hint of curiosity in her tone. "Why do you ask?" "I want in," I said, keeping my explanation brief. "I think it would be good for business." Carla hesitated for a moment, then agreed to see what she could do. By the end of the week I had my answer. I was in. The culinary show was a big deal, a chance to showcase my skills on a national stage. But this wasn't just about the exposure. This was about Jason, about finally facing him and making him pay for what he'd done. As the event approached, I threw myself into preparation. I worked late into the night perfecting recipes, refining techniques, and planning every detail, but underneath the surface, the real preparation was happening in my mind. I was crafting a strategy, a way to use my culinary skills not just to impress but to strike back. The day of the show arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. Chefs from all over the country were there, eager to prove themselves, but I wasn't just another competitor. I had a different goal, one that had nothing to do with winning. Jason arrived just as the first round of the competition was starting. He didn't notice me at first, too caught up in the attention of the crowd. But when our eyes finally met across the room, I saw a flicker of recognition. His smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of confusion, maybe even unease. I returned his gaze with a calm, neutral expression, letting him wonder what I was thinking. He had no idea what was coming, and I intended to keep it that way. As the competition progressed, I played my part perfectly. I delivered dish after dish, each one flawless, each one earning praise from the judges. But my real focus was on the final round, the moment when I would have a chance to serve Jason directly. When that moment finally came, I was ready. I prepared his dish with the same care and precision I gave to every plate, but with one small difference, a substitution that only I knew about. It was subtle, something that would take time to affect him, but it was enough. Enough to start the process of unraveling his perfect life, just as he'd unraveled mine. I watched as Jason took the first bite, his face showing no sign of suspicion. He even nodded approvingly, clearly enjoying the flavors. But as the meal went on, I saw the first signs of discomfort, an almost imperceptible wince, a slight furrowing of his brow. It was working. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Jason finished the meal, unaware of what I'd done, and I played the role of the gracious competitor, shaking hands and accepting compliments. All while a cold satisfaction settled in my chest. This was only the beginning. The following days at Harmony passed like a dream. On the surface, everything seemed normal. The restaurant was thriving, the reservations were still pouring in, and my staff worked with the same dedication that had made our opening week such a success. But underneath it all, I carried the knowledge of what I'd done at the culinary show, a secret victory that only I could savor. Jason Hale had no idea what I'd set in motion. The thought of it kept me going, fueling a quiet sense of satisfaction that I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't know how long it would take for the effects to fully hit him, but I was patient. This wasn't about a quick fix, it was about something deeper, something that would unravel him slowly, just as he'd unraveled my life. It wasn't until a week later that I saw the first signs of it working. I was in my office going over some paperwork when I decided to check the news. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, but then I saw it. An article on a celebrity gossip site with Jason's name in the headline. Jason Hale cancels concerts due to health issues. What's really going on? My heart skipped a beat as I clicked on the link. The article was filled with speculation, the usual rumors, and half-truths that surrounded someone like Jason. But buried in the text was a small detail that caught my eye. Jason had been experiencing unexplained stomach pains, severe enough that he'd been forced to cancel several upcoming shows. The doctors couldn't pinpoint the cause, but it was enough to sideline him for the foreseeable future. A slow smile spread across my face as I read. This was it. The first crack in his perfect facade. I could almost see him, struggling to maintain his image while his body betrayed him, just as he had betrayed me. The feeling was intoxicating. I'd done this. I'd taken control of the situation and turned the tables on him in a way that he couldn't see coming. But even as I reveled in my small victory, there was a part of me that couldn't shake the unease. Was this really what I wanted? To become someone who found joy in another's suffering? I pushed the thought aside, reminding myself of what he'd taken from me. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. He'd destroyed my marriage, my sense of security, my belief in the person I loved most. He deserved this. And maybe, just maybe, this would give me the closure I needed to move on. The next few days were a whirlwind. The news of Jason's health issues spread quickly, dominating the entertainment headlines. Fans were concerned, speculating wildly about the cause, while insiders claimed to have the scoop on everything from a secret illness to burnout from his grueling schedule. But the truth was something only I knew, and it was a truth that I guarded closely, savoring the power it gave me. It wasn't long before Jason's camp issued a statement, downplaying the rumors and assuring everyone that he would be back on stage soon. But the damage was done. His image had taken a hit, and the whispers wouldn't be easy to silence. I watched it all unfold with a mix of satisfaction and curiosity, wondering how far it would go. And how much more I could push before it all came crashing down. One evening as I was closing up the restaurant, my phone buzzed with a message. I glanced at it, expecting a text from one of my staff, but instead I saw a name I hadn't expected to hear from again. Laura, can we talk? I stared at the screen, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and something else, something I couldn't quite name. It had been months since we'd last spoken, since I'd walked out of our home and started this new chapter of my life. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to keep moving forward without looking back, but another part of me, the part that still felt the sting of her betrayal, was curious. What could she possibly want after all this time? I took a deep breath, typing out a quick response before I could second-guess myself. Me where? Her reply was almost immediate. Laura, our old place. Tomorrow at 7? I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with memories of the life we'd shared, the plans we'd made, and the lies that had torn it all apart. But there was no going back now. If she wanted to talk, I would hear her out. Maybe it would finally give me the closure I needed to put this chapter behind me for good. Me, I'll be there. The next day, as I made my way to the house I once called home, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. The neighborhood looked the same as ever, the familiar streets a painful reminder of everything I'd lost. But the house, our house, seemed different, as if the memories it held had aged, weathered by the storms we'd both endured. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the front door. The last time I'd been here, my world had been turned upside down. Now I was walking back into it, not as the man I once was, but as someone changed, hardened by the choices I'd made. Laura was waiting for me in the living room, sitting on the same couch where I'd caught her with Jason. The sight of her, so familiar yet so distant, stirred something deep inside me. I wasn't sure if it was anger, sadness, or something else entirely. "Tim," she said, her voice soft, almost pleading. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "What do you want, Laura?" She looked down at her hands, twisting a ring she no longer wore on her finger. "I wanted to apologize. For everything. I know I hurt you, and I've regretted it every day since." The words were ones I'd longed to hear months ago, but now they felt hollow, too little too late. "Regret doesn't change what happened," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "I know," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "But I need you to know that it wasn't about you. It was my mistake, my failure. You didn't deserve any of it. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay composed. Why now, Laura? Why reach out after all this time? She took a deep breath as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. Because Jason's in trouble. I don't know what's going on with him, but he's not well, Tim. He's convinced someone's out to get him, that he's being poisoned or something. It sounds crazy, but I'm worried. And I can't help but think that somehow you might know something about it. The air between us grew thick with tension, the weight of her words hanging heavy. I could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty. But more than that, I saw the woman I used to love, the woman I'd once trusted with everything. I let out a slow breath, trying to keep my voice steady. What makes you think I have anything to do with it? She hesitated, her gaze searching mine for answers I wasn't ready to give. I don't know. Maybe it's just guilt. Maybe I'm looking for someone to blame because I can't face what I've done. But I had to ask. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the unspoken truth hanging between us. I could see the desperation in her eyes, the hope that maybe, just maybe, I could help her make sense of what was happening. But I knew that I couldn't, because I was the one who had set this all in motion. I'm sorry, Laura, I finally said, standing up to leave, but whatever's happening to Jason, it's not my concern. Not anymore. She looked up at me, her expression a mix of pain and resignation. I just want you to be okay, Tim. That's all I've ever wanted. I turned away, my heart heavy with the weight of what I couldn't say. I'll be fine, Laura. I've found my own way to heal. As I walked out of the house for the last time, I felt a strange sense of finality. Laura had given me what I needed, the chance to close the door on that part of my life for good. But as I got into my car and drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that my quest for revenge had taken me down a path I wasn't sure I wanted to follow. Jason Hale was crumbling, just as I'd planned, but as the distance grew between me and the life I'd left behind, I couldn't help but wonder if I was crumbling too. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, each day blurring into the next as I tried to find a sense of normalcy amidst the chaos I'd created. The restaurant continued to thrive, customers blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. But no matter how many dishes I served, how many smiles I forced, I couldn't escape the growing sense of unease that gnawed at me. Laura's words echoed in my mind, haunting me like a ghost I couldn't shake. Jason's in trouble. He's convinced someone's out to get him. It was exactly what I'd wanted, proof that my plan was working. But instead of satisfaction, all I felt was a creeping dread that I couldn't ignore. Had I gone too far? Was this really the justice I'd been seeking, or had I crossed a line I couldn't come back from? One evening, after the last table had cleared and the staff had gone home, I sat alone in the empty restaurant, nursing a drink and staring at the walls that had once felt like my sanctuary. The pride I'd felt in building this place had been replaced by something darker, a nagging doubt that kept me awake at night. It didn't help that the news about Jason had only gotten worse. His health had continued to decline, and the rumors surrounding his condition had reached a fever pitch. The media was in a frenzy, speculating about everything from drug abuse to a secret illness. But the truth was something only I knew, and that knowledge weighed on me more heavily with each passing day. I knew I needed to get out of my own head, to focus on something other than the mess I'd made. So when Carla called me with an invitation to another culinary event, I jumped at the chance. It wasn't just an opportunity to showcase my skills. It was a chance to step away from the shadows of my own mind, if only for a little while. The event was being held at a prestigious venue in the city, a gathering of some of the top chefs in the country. As I arrived, I felt a familiar thrill, the excitement of being surrounded by others who shared my passion for food. But even as I mingled with the crowd, I couldn't completely shake the tension that had settled in my chest. As the evening wore on, I found myself drawn into a conversation with another chef, a woman named Grace who'd made a name for herself with innovative takes on classic dishes. We'd met before at various events, and I'd always admired her work. "Tim, you've been quiet tonight," she said, giving me a curious look. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile, trying to push my worries aside. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind, I guess." She raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "You know, I've always found that cooking is the best way to clear my head. When I'm in the kitchen, everything else just fades away." "I wish it were that simple," I said, taking a sip of my drink. "But sometimes the things on your mind follow you no matter where you go." Grace studied me for a moment, then nodded thoughtfully. "I get that. But whatever it is, you've got to find a way to deal with it. Otherwise, it'll eat you alive." Her words struck a chord, hitting closer to the truth than she could have known. I nodded, grateful for the distraction but unable to fully escape the storm inside me. We continued to chat, discussing everything from the latest culinary trends to the challenges of running a restaurant. But my thoughts kept drifting back to Jason, to Laura, to the path I'd chosen. By the time the event ended, I was more exhausted than I'd been in a long time. I drove home in silence, the city lights blurring as I sped through the streets. The high of the evening had worn off, leaving me with nothing but the cold reality of what I'd done. When I finally got back to my apartment, I collapsed onto the couch, staring up at the ceiling as if the answers I sought could be found there. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't silence the doubts that plagued me. I'd set out to punish Jason, to make him pay for the pain he'd caused me. But now, with his life unraveling before my eyes, I wasn't sure if I was punishing him, or myself. I reached for my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen as I debated what to do. Laura's message was still there, a reminder of the connection we once shared, the life we'd built and lost. Part of me wanted to call her, to hear her voice, to see if there was any way to make sense of the chaos. But I couldn't bring myself to do it, not yet. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in months. I picked up my guitar, the instrument that had once brought me so much joy, and started to play. The notes came slowly at first, hesitant, as if I'd forgotten how to express the emotions buried deep inside. But as I continued, the music flowed more freely, carrying with it the pain, the anger, the confusion. It wasn't long before I was completely lost in the music, the world outside fading away as I poured everything into the strings beneath my fingers. It was a release I hadn't known I needed, a way to process the feelings I'd been holding inside for so long. But even as the music filled the room, the doubts remained a constant presence that wouldn't be silenced. I'd set out on a path of revenge, believing it would bring me peace. But now, as I sat alone in the dark, I couldn't help but wonder if I was losing myself in the process. The next morning, I woke up to a flood of messages on my phone. Most were from colleagues congratulating me on last night's event, but one message stood out, a text from Carla. "Carla, Tim, we need to talk. It's about Jason." My heart sank as I read the words. Whatever this was, it couldn't be good. I took a deep breath and called her back, bracing myself for what she might say. "Tim, I'm sorry to bother you so early," Carla said, her voice filled with concern. "But I just got word that Jason was admitted to the hospital last night. It's serious, Tim. They don't know what's wrong with him." I closed my eyes, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a physical force. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for, the culmination of my plan. But instead of the satisfaction I'd expected, all I felt was a crushing sense of guilt. What happened?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're not sure," Carla said. "But it's bad, Tim, really bad. I know you and Jason have a history, but I thought you should know." I thanked her for the information and hung up, my mind racing as I tried to process what I'd just heard. Jason was in the hospital, his life hanging in the balance, and it was all because of me. I'd wanted to make him suffer, to make him pay for what he'd done. But now, as the reality of my actions hit me, I wasn't sure if I could live with the consequences. For the first time since this all began, I questioned everything, my motives, my choices, my own humanity. I'd set out to destroy the man who destroyed me, but in doing so, had I become something even worse? The doubts I'd been trying to ignore were no longer whispers in the back of my mind. They were a full-blown storm, and there was no escaping it now. As I sat in the silence of my apartment, I realized that I was standing at a crossroads. I could continue down this path fueled by anger and revenge, or I could find a way to stop, to salvage what was left of my soul. But the choice wouldn't be easy, and no matter what I decided, I knew one thing for certain: the road ahead would be filled with consequences, ones I might not be ready to face. The next few days were a blur, each one more agonizing than the last. I tried to lose myself in work, to focus on the restaurant, the customers, and anything that could distract me from the gnawing guilt that consumed me. But no matter how many hours I spent in the kitchen, no matter how many dishes I perfected, I couldn't escape the weight of what I'd done. Jason was still in the hospital. The news was everywhere, the media buzzing with speculation about his condition. The official statements were vague, complications and ongoing tests were the only clues given to the public. But I knew the truth, or at least a part of it. I was the one who had set this chain of events in motion, and now, as the consequences unfolded before me, I found myself trapped in a web of my own making. One evening, after another long day at the restaurant, I received a call from Carla. I hesitated before answering, my heart pounding in my chest. I had a feeling I knew what she was going to say, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear it. "Tim," she began, her voice strained with worry. "I just left the hospital. Jason's not doing well. The doctors still don't know what's wrong, and it's getting worse." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What do you mean, worse?" "They've run every test they can think of, but nothing adds up," she explained. "He's in constant pain and his body's shutting down. Tim, they don't think he's going to make it." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless. I'd wanted to make Jason suffer, but I'd never imagined it would come to this. The realization that I might be responsible for someone's death was too much to bear. I didn't know it would go this far," I stammered, my voice shaking. Carla was silent for a moment, then she sighed. "Tim, I don't know what's going on, but I can tell something's eating you up inside. If there's anything you need to tell me, anything at all, now's the time." The truth hovered on the tip of my tongue, threatening to spill out. I wanted to confess, to unload the burden I'd been carrying, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. If I admitted what I'd done, there would be no turning back. I'd lose everything: my restaurant, my reputation, my freedom. But more than that, I'd have to face the reality that I was no better than the man I'd sought to destroy. I don't know what to say, Carla," I finally replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted to this." "I know," she said softly, "but whatever it is, you have to find a way to make peace with it, before it eats you alive." After we hung up, I sat in silence, my mind racing. Carla was right, this guilt was tearing me apart, and if I didn't do something about it, it would destroy me. But what could I do? Confessing would only bring more pain and more suffering, and it wouldn't change what had already happened. I spent the next few hours pacing my apartment, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear, anger, and regret. I'd set out to take control of my life, to reclaim what Jason had taken from me, but all I'd done was create a new kind of hell for myself. By the time the sun began to rise, I knew I couldn't go on like this. I needed to do something, anything, to make things right, but the path ahead was murky, and I wasn't sure if redemption was even possible at this point. I made my way to the hospital later that morning, my stomach in knots as I approached the front desk. I gave the nurse Jason's name, half expecting her to turn me away, but instead she nodded and directed me to his room. As I walked down the sterile hallway, the sounds of beeping monitors and hushed conversations filled the air, heightening my anxiety. I felt like an imposter, like I didn't belong here. But I knew I had to see him to face the reality of what I'd done. When I reached Jason's room, I hesitated outside the door, my hand hovering over the handle. I wasn't sure what I expected to find on the other side, but nothing could have prepared me for the sight that greeted me when I finally stepped inside. Jason lay on the bed, his once vibrant features gaunt and pale, his eyes closed as if he were in a deep sleep. The strong, charismatic man who had stolen my wife and turned my life upside down was now a shadow of his former self, weakened and vulnerable. I stood there for a moment, unable to move, my heart pounding in my chest. The sight of him like this was jarring, a stark reminder of the power I'd wielded and the consequences of my actions. Slowly I approached the bed, my footsteps echoing in the small room. Jason didn't stir, didn't acknowledge my presence, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of guilt so deep it nearly brought me to my knees. I didn't know what I expected to say, but when I opened my mouth, the words came out in a choked whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Jason. I wanted you to feel the pain I felt." There was no response, only the steady beeping of the heart monitor beside him. I took a deep breath, the reality of the situation crashing down on me like a tidal wave. "I thought I was justified," I continued, my voice trembling. "You took everything from me, and I wanted to make you pay. But I never wanted this. I never wanted to be the one responsible for someone else's suffering." My confession hung in the air, a weighty silence filling the room. I wasn't sure if Jason could hear me, or if he was even aware of what was happening around him, but I needed to say it, for my own sake, if nothing else. "I don't know how to fix this," I admitted, my voice breaking, "but I'm sorry for everything." For a long moment I stood there, waiting for some kind of response, some sign that Jason had heard me, that he understood. But there was nothing, only the cold, sterile silence of the hospital room. As I turned to leave, I felt a tear slip down my cheek, a small crack in the facade I'd tried so hard to maintain. I wiped it away quickly, determined to hold on to what little composure I had left, but as I stepped out into the hallway, the weight of my guilt was still there, pressing down on me with every step. I'd sought revenge, but all I'd found was a deeper kind of suffering, one that I wasn't sure I could escape from. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to clear my mind, but the doubts and regrets clung to me like a second skin. I knew I couldn't go back to the life I'd had before, couldn't undo what I'd done, but I also knew that I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a cycle of revenge and guilt. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, I found myself parked outside the church where I used to sing in the choir. It had been months since I'd been here, months since I'd stepped foot inside the place that had once brought me so much peace. I wasn't sure what had brought me here now. Maybe it was a desperate need for solace, or maybe it was a subconscious pull toward something familiar. But as I sat there staring at the old stone building, I realized that this was where I needed to be. I stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the entrance, my footsteps echoing on the pavement. The doors creaked open as I pushed them, revealing the dimly lit sanctuary beyond. The familiar scent of incense and candle wax filled the air, bringing with it a flood of memories. I walked down the aisle, my eyes scanning the rows of pews where I'd once sat, where I'd once found comfort in the hymns and the prayers. But now the place felt different, as if the peace I'd once known had been replaced by something heavier, something darker. I sank into a pew near the front, my head bowed as I tried to find the words to pray. But the words wouldn't come, and I was left with nothing but the heavy silence of the empty church. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my guilt, to acknowledge the pain I'd caused, not just to Jason, but to myself as well. I'd thought revenge would bring me closure, but all it had done was open up wounds that I wasn't sure would ever heal. As I sat there, the quiet of the sanctuary slowly began to soothe my troubled mind, the flickering candles casting a soft glow over the altar. It wasn't a solution and it wasn't an absolution, but it was a start, a small step toward something resembling peace. I knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with more questions than answers. But as I left the church that evening, I felt a small glimmer of hope, a faint light in the darkness that had consumed me for so long. For the first time since this all began, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness, a way to find redemption, not just for Jason but for myself as well. The morning after my visit to the church, I woke up with a sense of clarity that I hadn't felt in months. The guilt and anger still lingered, but there was something else now, a faint but growing resolve to make things right, or at least to try. I went to the restaurant early, before anyone else arrived, and spent some time alone in the kitchen. The familiar sounds and smells helped ground me, bringing me back to the reason I'd started this journey in the first place. Cooking had always been my way of finding peace, of creating something beautiful out of chaos, but lately, it had become a weapon, a means of exacting revenge rather than an expression of my passion. I knew I couldn't undo the damage I'd done to Jason, but I could at least stop making things worse. I made a decision then and there to stop tampering with his food, to let go of the need for retribution that had consumed me for so long. It wouldn't erase the past, but it was a step in the right direction. As the day wore on, I found myself thinking about Laura. I hadn't spoken to her since the night she told me about Jason's health, and I wondered how she was holding up. Part of me wanted to reach out to see if there was any way to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. But another part of me wasn't sure if I was ready to face her yet, to confront the reality of our broken marriage. That evening, as I was closing up the restaurant, I got a call from Carla. My heart skipped a beat when I saw her name on the screen, a mix of fear and hope surging through me. "Tim, I just wanted to give you an update," she said when I answered. "Jason's condition has stabilized. The doctors still don't know what's causing his symptoms, but he's not getting worse at least. They're hopeful he'll pull through." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, a wave of relief washing over me. "That's good to hear," I said, my voice shaky with emotion. "Thank you for letting me know, Carla." "I thought you'd want to know," she replied. There was a pause, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice before she continued. "Tim, I don't know what's been going on with you lately, but if you ever need to talk, I'm here." I swallowed hard, the weight of her offer hitting me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't sure if I was ready to open up to her, or anyone, for that matter, but the fact that she cared enough to offer meant more than I could put into words. "Thanks, Carla," I said finally. "I appreciate that." After we hung up, I sat in the empty restaurant, the silence around me feeling heavier than ever. Jason's improvement was a small victory, but it didn't erase the guilt I felt for what I'd done. I knew I couldn't just go back to the way things were before. Too much had happened, too much damage had been done. But I also knew I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a cycle of self-destruction. The next day, I decided to take another step toward making things right. I reached out to Jason's manager and offered to help with his recovery in any way I could. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the right thing to do. If nothing else, it was a way to start rebuilding the humanity I'd lost in my quest for revenge. To my surprise, the manager accepted my offer, and I found myself helping to organize a fundraiser to cover Jason's medical expenses. It was a strange feeling, being part of something that was meant to help the man I'd once considered my enemy. But as I worked alongside others who genuinely cared about Jason's well-being, I started to see him in a different light. He wasn't just the man who had hurt me. He was a person with his own struggles, his own pain, and his own need for redemption. The fundraiser was a success, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of pride in something I'd done. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it didn't erase the past, but it was a step toward healing, both for Jason and for myself. A few days after the fundraiser, I received a message from Laura. It was brief, just a few lines, but it was enough to stop me in my tracks. "Laura, I heard about the fundraiser. Thank you for helping Jason. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time, my emotions a tangled mess. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face her, to confront everything that had happened between us. But I also knew that I couldn't keep avoiding her forever. If there was any chance of finding closure, whatever that looked like, I had to be willing to take that step. I took a deep breath and typed out a reply. "Me, yes, we can talk. When and where?" Her response came quickly. "Laura, how about tomorrow evening? I'll come by the restaurant after closing." I agreed, and we set a time. As I put my phone down, a sense of apprehension settled over me. The prospect of seeing Laura again, of talking about everything that had happened, filled me with both dread and hope. There was so much unsaid between us, so much pain and betrayal that had never been fully addressed. The next evening, after the last customer had left and the staff had gone home, I waited for Laura in the quiet of the restaurant. I'd replayed our upcoming conversation in my head 100 times, but now that the moment was here, I felt completely unprepared. When she finally walked through the door, my heart skipped a beat. She looked different, thinner, more tired, but there was a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. "Hi, Tim," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Hi, Laura," I replied, my voice just as quiet. We sat down at one of the tables, the same table where we'd once shared countless meals and conversations. Back when things were simpler. The memories of those times flooded back, bittersweet and painful. "I'm not sure where to start," Laura admitted after a long pause. "There's so much I want to say, but I don't even know if it matters anymore." "It matters," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. "It all matters, Laura. We can't change what happened, but we can at least try to understand it." She nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. "I'm sorry, Tim. I'm so sorry for everything I did and for how I hurt you. I was selfish, and I let my own desires get in the way of what really mattered." I felt a lump form in my throat as I listened to her words, the sincerity in her voice piercing through the walls I'd built around my heart. "I'm sorry too," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't there for you the way I should have been. I let my own insecurities and fears drive us apart." For a long time we talked, really talked, for the first time in what felt like forever. We laid everything out on the table, the pain, the anger, the regrets. It was a painful conversation, but it was also cathartic, a necessary step toward healing. By the time we were done, the weight that had been pressing down on me for so long felt a little lighter. There were no easy answers and no quick fixes, but there was a sense of understanding that hadn't been there before. As Laura got up to leave, she paused at the door and turned back to me. "Tim, I don't know what the future holds for us, but I want you to know that I still care about you. I always have." "I care about you too, Laura," I replied, my voice filled with the truth of the words. "Whatever happens, I want you to be happy. I want us both to be happy." She smiled, a sad but genuine smile, and then she was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet of the restaurant once more. I stood there for a long time, reflecting on everything that had happened. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right track. I didn't know if I could ever fully make amends for what I'd done, but I was willing to try, to rebuild my life one step at a time. As I locked up the restaurant and walked out into the cool night air, I realized that this journey was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, still wounds that needed healing, but I wasn't alone in facing them. I had a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to finding peace, not just for myself, but for everyone I'd hurt along the way. And in that moment, as I looked up at the stars overhead, I felt a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible after all. A week had passed since my conversation with Laura, and I was still trying to make sense of everything. There was a strange calm in the aftermath, a quiet in my mind that I hadn't felt in a long time. But beneath that calm, there was also an emptiness, a void that I wasn't sure how to fill. I threw myself into the work at the restaurant, hoping to find some solace in the routine. Cooking had always been my refuge, a way to channel my emotions into something tangible, something real. But even that wasn't enough to distract me from the questions that kept swirling in my head. One evening, as I was prepping for dinner service, Carla stopped by the kitchen. She'd been a constant presence over the past few months, helping me navigate the chaos of running the restaurant while dealing with everything else. I'd come to rely on her more than I cared to admit, and I was grateful for her steady support. "Tim, can we talk for a minute?" she asked, her tone serious. Sure, I replied, setting down the knife I'd been using to chop vegetables. What's on your mind? She hesitated as if searching for the right words. I've noticed a change in you lately, she said finally. You're quieter, more reflective. I just want to make sure you're okay. I forced a smile, though I knew it didn't reach my eyes. I'm fine, Carla, just trying to figure some things out. You don't have to go through this alone, you know, she said softly. Whatever it is, I'm here for you. We all are. Her words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I'd spent so much time isolating myself, pushing people away, that I'd forgotten what it was like to have someone truly care. Thanks, Carla, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I appreciate that more than you know. She gave me a small, understanding smile. You've been through a lot, Tim. It's okay to lean on others sometimes. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was so much I wanted to say, but I wasn't sure where to start. I wasn't even sure if I could put my feelings into words. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. By the way, I heard from Jason's manager, she said. He's doing better. They're optimistic about his recovery. A surge of relief washed over me, mixed with a pang of guilt. I hadn't thought about Jason much since our last encounter, but the news of his improvement lifted a weight off my shoulders. That's good to hear, I said quietly. Yeah, it is, she agreed. Maybe this is a sign that things are starting to turn around. I wanted to believe that, to hold on to the hope that things could get better. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that the damage had already been done, that no amount of redemption could erase the scars of the past. After Carla left, I stood alone in the kitchen, the sounds of the bustling restaurant muted in the background. I thought about everything that had led me to this point, the betrayal, the anger, the revenge, and I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made the right choices. Was there a way to truly move forward, to find peace after everything that had happened, or was I destined to carry this burden with me for the rest of my life? The next day I received an unexpected visit from Jason's manager, Rick. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, the type who rarely showed emotion. But there was seriousness in his eyes as he sat down across from me in the empty restaurant. Tim, I wanted to talk to you about Jason, he began, his tone measured. He's made a lot of progress, but the doctors are still concerned about his long-term health. They've advised him to take an extended break from performing. I nodded, unsure of what to say. That's probably for the best, I said finally. Rick studied me for a moment before continuing. Jason's been through a lot and he's going to need time to recover, both physically and mentally, but he's also expressed a desire to meet with you once he's feeling better. My heart skipped a beat at his words. The idea of facing Jason, of having to confront everything that had happened between us, filled me with a mix of dread and anticipation. Why does he want to meet with me? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't go into detail, but I think he wants to clear the air, Rick replied. There's been a lot of tension, a lot of unanswered questions, and I think he feels that talking to you might help him find some closure. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to refuse, to avoid reopening old wounds, but another part of me knew that this was something I needed to face. If I was ever going to move on, I couldn't keep running from my past. When does he want to meet? I asked after a long pause. I'll let you know when he's ready, Rick said. It could be a few weeks, maybe longer. He needs to focus on his recovery first. I nodded again, my mind racing with possibilities. The idea of sitting down with Jason, of having to confront everything head-on, was terrifying. But at the same time, I knew it was a necessary step in the healing process, both for him and for me. After Rick left, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The prospect of facing Jason, of having to relive everything that had happened, was daunting. But I also knew that this was an opportunity, perhaps the only opportunity, to find some semblance of peace. Over the next few days, I tried to prepare myself for the inevitable meeting. I replayed the events of the past year over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it all, trying to figure out what I would say when the time came. One evening, as I was closing up the restaurant, I received a text from Laura. Laura, I heard Jason's doing better. I'm glad. How are you holding up? I stared at the message for a long time, my emotions a tangled mess. I wasn't sure how to answer her, wasn't sure if I even knew how I was holding up, but I also knew that she cared, that she was trying to reach out in her own way. Me, I'm managing. It's been tough, but I'm getting through it. Her response came quickly. Laura, if you ever need to talk, I'm here. I know we have a lot to work through, but I want to be there for you if you'll let me. I felt a pang of longing as I read her words. A part of me wished things could go back to the way they were before everything fell apart. But I also knew that there was no going back, only forward. Me, thanks Laura, I appreciate that. Maybe we can talk soon. I put my phone down, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. The idea of talking to Laura, of trying to rebuild some semblance of a relationship, was both comforting and terrifying. There was so much history between us, so much pain and betrayal, that I wasn't sure if it was possible to truly move on. But as I sat there in the quiet of the restaurant, I realized that I couldn't keep running from my past. I couldn't keep avoiding the difficult conversations, the painful truths. If I was ever going to find peace, I had to be willing to face the darkness head-on, to confront the demons that had haunted me for so long. And so, I made a decision. I would meet with Jason when the time came, and I would talk to Laura when I was ready. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't be painless, but it was the only way forward. As I locked up the restaurant and walked out into the night, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. I didn't know where it would lead, but I was ready to find out. Weeks passed, and the tension inside me grew with each passing day. I kept busy with the restaurant, diving into new recipes and refining old ones, but my mind was always somewhere else, focused on the looming confrontation with Jason. I had no idea what to expect from our meeting, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. One evening as I was closing up, I received a call from Rick, Jason's manager. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying seriousness that put me on edge. "Tim, Jason's ready to meet with you," Rick said. "He's been recovering well, and he thinks it's time to clear the air." My heart pounded as I took in his words. This was the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating. "When does he want to meet?" "Tomorrow afternoon," Rick replied. He suggested meeting at his place, somewhere private where you two can talk without interruptions. I hesitated, the weight of the situation settling heavily on my shoulders. But I knew there was no turning back now. This was something that needed to happen. "All right, I'll be there," I finally said. The next day I arrived at Jason's house, my stomach in knots. His place was modest, nothing like the lavish lifestyle one might expect from a famous musician. It was clear that Jason had retreated into himself, seeking solitude during his recovery. Rick greeted me at the door, his expression neutral. "He's waiting for you inside," he said, leading me through the quiet, dimly lit hallway. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the house itself was bracing for the conversation that was about to unfold. When we entered the living room, I saw Jason sitting on the couch. He looked different, thinner, paler, and there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The illness had taken its toll, but there was still a hint of the charismatic energy that had once captivated so many, including my wife. "Tim," Jason said, his voice soft but steady. "Thanks for coming." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. The last time we'd been in the same room, the tension had been unbearable, fueled by anger and betrayal. But now, there was a different kind of tension, a mutual understanding that things had gone too far, that we were both responsible for the pain we'd caused each other. I didn't know what to expect from this meeting, I admitted, breaking the silence, but I knew we had to talk. Jason nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Yeah, we do. I've had a lot of time to think about everything, and I realize that I owe you an apology." His words caught me off guard. I hadn't expected him to apologize, especially not so directly. "You don't have to," I started, but he cut me off. "No, I do," he insisted, looking up at me. "I didn't just betray Laura, I betrayed you too. I knew she was married, and I still went after her. I was selfish, thinking only of what I wanted, and I didn't care about the consequences." I took a deep breath, trying to process his words. The anger that had once consumed me had faded over time, replaced by a weariness that I couldn't shake. "I'm not innocent in all this either," I said quietly. "After I found out about you and Laura, I let my anger take over. I did things I'm not proud of, things that hurt you in ways I can't take back." Jason nodded, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, I figured as much. The food tampering. It explains a lot." Guilt washed over me as I met his gaze. "I'm sorry, Jason. I wanted to hurt you the way you hurt me, but in the end, all it did was make things worse." He sighed, leaning back against the couch. "We've both made mistakes, Tim. But I think we both know that revenge isn't the answer. It never is." There was a long silence between us as we absorbed the weight of his words. He was right, of course. Revenge had done nothing but deepen the wounds, prolonging the pain for both of us. "I don't know where we go from here," I said finally, my voice heavy with uncertainty. "But I do know that I'm tired of all the anger and resentment. It's been eating away at me for too long." Jason nodded in agreement. "Me too. I've lost so much because of this. My health, my career, my peace of mind. I don't want to keep living in the past." For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt a sense of relief. This conversation wasn't about placing blame or seeking retribution. It was about finding a way forward, about healing the wounds we'd both inflicted. As the afternoon wore on, we talked more about our lives, our regrets, and our hopes for the future. It was a strange, almost surreal experience, sitting there with the man who had once been my enemy, finding common ground in our shared pain. By the time I left Jason's house, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over the quiet neighborhood. I felt lighter, as if a burden I'd been carrying for months had finally been lifted. The road to healing was still long, and I knew there would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. When I got back to the restaurant that evening, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the ingredients laid out on the counter. Cooking had always been my way of coping, of making sense of the chaos in my life. But now, it felt like more than that. It felt like a way to move forward, to create something new out of the ashes of the past. As I began preparing a dish, I realized that this wasn't just about food. It was about healing, about finding peace in the process of creation. Each chop of the knife, each stir of the pot, was a step toward rebuilding my life, toward finding a new sense of purpose. And as the aroma of the meal filled the kitchen, I felt a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to move on from the past and build something better for the future. I knew there were still difficult conversations to be had, especially with Laura, but for now I was content to take things one step at a time, to let the healing process unfold in its own time. The next day I received a text from Jason. "Jason, thanks for meeting with me yesterday. It meant a lot. I'm ready to start over, to put the past behind us. I hope we can both find the peace we're looking for." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I'm ready too. Let's move forward and make something good out of all this. We both deserve that. As I put my phone down, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The past was still there, a part of who I was, but it no longer defined me. I was ready to let go, to find peace, and to start building a future that wasn't weighed down by the mistakes of yesterday. The days following my meeting with Jason were a blur of activity. The restaurant kept me busy, and for the first time in a long while, I found myself looking forward to each day. The weight that had been pressing down on me seemed lighter, and I could finally breathe a little easier. But there was still one conversation I needed to have, one that I'd been putting off, even though I knew it was inevitable. It was time to talk to Laura. I wasn't sure what to expect. Our relationship had been strained for so long that I couldn't even remember what it felt like to be truly open with her. We'd exchanged a few texts since Jason's recovery, but they'd been short and distant, avoiding the real issues that lay between us. But now that I'd confronted Jason and found some measure of peace, I knew I couldn't move forward without addressing the elephant in the room. I decided to invite her to the restaurant after hours. It was the one place where I felt in control, where I could create an environment that was calm and familiar. I hoped it would make the conversation easier, though I knew it was going to be anything but easy. When she arrived that evening, I was waiting for her in the dining area. The tables were set, but the restaurant was empty, the lights dimmed to create a warm, intimate atmosphere. Laura looked nervous as she walked in, her eyes darting around the room before settling on me. "Oh, thanks for meeting me here," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. She nodded, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, Tim. I think it's time we talked." I gestured for her to sit, and we both settled into our chairs, an awkward silence hanging between us. I could feel the tension, the unspoken words that had been building up for months. "So, how have you been?" I asked, knowing it was a weak start but not sure how else to begin. Laura sighed, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the tablecloth. "I've been okay, I guess. It hasn't been easy, but I'm trying to move forward. And you?" I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. After everything that happened, I realized I needed to make some changes. I had to figure out who I was without all the anger and resentment." She looked down, her expression pained. "I know I hurt you, Tim, more than I ever thought possible. And I'm sorry for that, truly I am. I never meant for things to get so out of control." Hearing her apology didn't bring the relief I thought it would. Instead, it brought a flood of conflicting emotions, anger, sadness, and, oddly enough, a sense of pity. "I know, Laura. And I'm sorry too. I didn't handle things well, and I let my hurt turn into something ugly." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about how we got to this point. I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were, but I want to try to understand what went wrong." For the first time in months we were really talking, and it was both terrifying and cathartic. I could see the pain in her eyes, the regret that mirrored my own. But I also knew that understanding the past wouldn't change it. "I think we lost sight of each other somewhere along the way," I said, my voice steady. We got so caught up in our own lives, our own problems, that we stopped really seeing each other. And when things got tough, instead of leaning on each other, we drifted apart. Laura nodded, wiping away a tear. You're right. I was so focused on what I thought was missing from my life that I didn't see what I was doing to you, to us. And by the time I realized it, it was too late. There was a long silence as we both sat with our thoughts. I could feel the weight of the years between us, the history that had once bound us together but had now become a barrier. So where do we go from here? She asked quietly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. I didn't have an easy answer. Part of me wanted to hold on to the life we'd built, to find a way to rebuild what we'd lost. But another part of me knew that some things couldn't be repaired, that maybe the best we could hope for was a peaceful ending. I think we need to take things one step at a time, I said finally. I'm not sure what the future holds, but I know that we both need to heal individually and together. Maybe that means spending time apart, figuring out who we are on our own, or maybe it means working on this slowly without any expectations. Laura looked at me, her expression a mix of hope and sadness. I'd like that. I'd like to try at least. But I also understand if that's not what you want. I shook my head, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. I want to try, Laura, but I think we need to be honest with ourselves about what that means. We can't pretend that everything will go back to the way it was. We have to be willing to face the reality of what's happened, and decide if we can build something new from it. She nodded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a glimmer of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least now we were on the same page, ready to face whatever came next together. We spent the rest of the evening talking, not about the past or the future, but about the present, where we were now and what we wanted out of life. It was a small step, but it felt like progress, like the beginning of something new. As we said our goodbyes, there was no dramatic declaration of love, no promises of a perfect future. Instead, there was a quiet understanding, a mutual respect for the journey we were both on. Take care, Tim, she said softly as she turned to leave. We'll figure this out, one way or another. Yeah, I replied, watching her walk away. We will. As I stood alone in the empty restaurant, I felt a strange sense of peace. The conversation with Laura hadn't magically fixed everything, but it had brought a sense of closure. A feeling that I was finally ready to move forward, whatever that might look like. The path ahead was still unclear, but for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. I'd confronted my past and faced the demons that had haunted me for so long, and now I was ready to embrace whatever the future held. And as I turned off the lights and locked up the restaurant, I knew that I was finally free. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of my modest apartment, casting a warm glow over the scattered cookbooks and sheet music that had become a staple in my living space. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I woke up with a sense of calm rather than a weight pressing down on my chest. The conversations with Jason and Laura had lifted a burden I hadn't realized I was still carrying. But with that relief came a new kind of uncertainty. What was next for me? I made my way to Harmony, the restaurant that had been both my refuge and my prison. As I walked through the quiet dining room before opening hours, I felt a deep connection to the space. Every table, every piece of decor, every item on the menu held a piece of my journey. This place saved me when I was lost, and gave me purpose when I felt purposeless, but now, standing alone in the soft morning light, I wondered if it was time to let go. Carla found me in the kitchen, staring thoughtfully at a blank notepad. Tim, you look like you're a million miles away, she said, her eyes searching mine. I offered a faint smile. Just doing some thinking. Care to share, she asked, leaning against the counter. I took a deep breath. I've been considering making some changes, big ones. She raised an eyebrow. What kind of changes? I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. I think it's time for me to step away from the restaurant. Her eyes widened in surprise. You're closing Harmony? Why, the place is doing great. I know, I replied, feeling a mix of pride and melancholy. But I started this restaurant as a way to rebuild myself, to find a new path after everything fell apart. Now that I've made peace with the past, I feel like I'm holding on to something I no longer need. Carla was silent for a moment, digesting my words. Have you thought this through? She asked gently. Honestly, it's all I've been thinking about, I admitted. I want to find out who I am outside of this place. Maybe reconnect with old passions, explore new ones. She nodded slowly. I can't say I'm not surprised, but I understand. Sometimes we need to close one chapter to start another. Exactly, I said, grateful for her support. I was hoping you'd help me with the transition. Maybe find someone who can take over, someone who loves this place as much as I do. A soft smile spread across her face. You know I'll help in any way I can. Over the next few weeks we worked tirelessly to ensure a smooth handover. Word got out that I was leaving, and regular customers expressed their sadness but also their support for my decision. It was bittersweet, saying goodbye to the life I'd built here, but I knew it was the right choice. One evening, after the last service under my ownership, I hosted a small gathering for the staff and close friends. The atmosphere was warm and filled with laughter, a celebration of not just the restaurant but the community we'd built within it. As the night wound down, I found myself sitting at one of the corner tables, a glass of wine in hand. Laura approached me cautiously, a tentative smile on her face. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. "Not at all," I replied, gesturing to the seat across from me. She sat down, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the candle between us. "I heard you're leaving the restaurant." "Word travels fast," I said with a chuckle. "Yeah, I think it's time." "How do you feel about IT?" she asked. I considered the question, liberated, scared, excited, all of the above. She nodded thoughtfully. "So what's next for you?" I took a sip of my wine, pondering the answer. "I'm not entirely sure. Maybe I'll get back into music, maybe I'll travel. I just know I want to explore parts of myself that I've neglected." A hopeful look crossed her face. "I'd love to hear you sing again." "Maybe you will," I said softly. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment before she spoke again. "I'm happy for you, Tim. You deserve to find happiness." "Thank you, Laura," I replied. "I hope you find the same." As the party wrapped up, I felt a sense of closure. The restaurant had been a significant chapter in my life, but it was just that, a chapter. And now, it was time to turn the page. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, the first light of dawn just breaking over the horizon. Instead of the familiar routine of heading to the restaurant, I grabbed my guitar, a relic from my choir days, and made my way to a nearby park. The air was crisp and the city was still waking up as I sat on a bench overlooking a small pond. I strummed a few chords, the notes shaky at first but gradually gaining confidence. Music had always been my first love, a way to express emotions I couldn't put into words. Lost in the melody, I didn't notice the elderly man who had stopped to listen until the song ended. "You play beautifully," he said, his eyes warm. "Thank you," I replied, a bit self-conscious. "Do you perform professionally?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, just for myself," he smiled. "Well, you should consider sharing your gift. The world could use more beauty these days." I pondered his words as he walked away. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time to share this part of myself again. Over the next few weeks, I began attending open mic nights at local venues. The first time I stepped on stage, nerves threatened to get the best of me, but as I began to sing, a calm washed over me. The audience's applause at the end was more rewarding than I could have imagined. One night, after a particularly spirited performance, I was approached by a talent scout who invited me to audition for a community musical. It wasn't a Broadway debut, but it was an opportunity to immerse myself in music once more. As rehearsals began, I found joy in the camaraderie and creativity of the ensemble. I was rediscovering parts of myself that I'd long forgotten, pieces that had been overshadowed by pain and regret. One evening after rehearsal, I received a text from Jason. "Jason, heard you're back into music, that's great news. Maybe we'll share a stage someday." I smiled at the message, grateful for the unexpected friendship that had grown from our shared past. Thanks Jason, I'd like that." Life was far from perfect, but it was real and unscripted, filled with possibilities I hadn't considered before. I was no longer the man consumed by betrayal or revenge. I was simply Tim, a man finding his way, one day at a time. As I stood on the stage during the opening night of the musical, the lights bright and the audience buzzing with anticipation, I took a deep breath. This was where I was meant to be, not lost in the shadows of the past but embracing the uncertainties of the future. The music started, and I began to sing, my voice strong and clear. In that moment, surrounded by the collective energy of the performers and the audience, I felt truly alive. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, I was okay with that. I had made peace with my past, reconnected with my passions, and opened myself up to new experiences. As the final notes of the performance echoed through the theater, the audience rose in a standing ovation. I looked out into the crowd and spotted familiar faces, Carla, Laura, and even Jason, all applauding with genuine smiles. As the curtain fell, I realized that while the journey had been long and fraught with challenges, it had led me here, to a place of acceptance, growth, and endless possibility. The next chapter of my life was unwritten, but I was ready to face it head-on, armed with the lessons of the past and the hope of the future. As the final curtain call came and went, and the theater emptied of its enthusiastic crowd, I found myself standing alone on the stage, bathed in the dim glow of the remaining lights. The applause had faded, but the warmth it left behind lingered in my chest. The sense of accomplishment was almost surreal. I had navigated through the darkest chapters of my life and emerged on the other side still standing. The rest of the cast had already headed out to celebrate, but I lingered behind, savoring the quiet of the empty theater. It was a stark contrast to the chaos that had defined my life for so long. There was no more anger, no more need for revenge, just a calm acceptance of where I was and a hopeful curiosity about where I might be headed. I made my way to the dressing room to change out of my costume, my mind wandering to what lay ahead. The Community musical had reignited a passion I thought I'd lost forever, and I knew this was only the beginning. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't in a hurry to figure it all out. I was content to let things unfold at their own pace, trusting that the path would reveal itself in time. As I packed up my belongings, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Laura. "Laura, great job tonight, Tim. I'm really proud of you." I smiled, touched by her words. We were both on our own journeys now, and while our paths had diverged, there was still mutual respect and care that lingered between us. It wasn't the love we once had, but it was something else, something softer, more mature. "Me, thanks, Laura. That means a lot." After a moment's hesitation, I added another line. "Me, how about we catch up over coffee sometime?" Her reply was almost immediate. "Laura, I'd like that. Let's plan something soon." I tucked my phone into my pocket, feeling a sense of closure. Whatever our relationship would evolve into, I knew it was built on a foundation of understanding and forgiveness. We had both made mistakes, but we had also both grown from them. As I stepped out of the theater into the cool night air, I felt a lightness in my step. The city was alive with energy, people milling about, cars honking in the distance, and the scent of street food wafting through the air. It felt like the world was wide open, full of possibilities. I walked through the city streets with no particular destination in mind, just enjoying the freedom that came with not knowing where I was going. For the first time in years, I didn't feel lost. I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Eventually, I found myself near a small park, a place I had visited often during my darkest days. It had been a sanctuary when I needed to think, to process, to figure out how to keep moving forward when all I wanted to do was stop. But tonight, as I sat down on one of the familiar benches, the memories didn't hurt anymore. They were simply a part of my story, chapters that had led me to this moment. I took out my guitar, the same one I'd rediscovered a few months ago, and began to play softly. The notes drifted through the air, mixing with the sounds of the city. It was a quiet, intimate moment, just me and the music, a reminder that I had found my way back to something that truly mattered. As I played, a small group of people walking by stopped to listen, their faces lit up with curiosity and appreciation. It wasn't a grand performance, just a simple serenade under the stars, but it was enough. I didn't need a stage or an audience of thousands. I just needed this, the connection, the expression, the joy of creating something beautiful. When I finished the song, the onlookers clapped, offering kind words of encouragement as they continued on their way. I smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment that was deeper and more genuine than anything I'd felt in a long time. As I put my guitar back in its case, I felt a strange sense of completion. The journey I'd been on, through betrayal, heartbreak, anger, and revenge, had brought me to a place of peace. I wasn't defined by what had happened to me, but by how I had chosen to respond to it. I had found my way back to myself, and in doing so, I had opened up a future that was full of potential. I stood up, slinging the guitar case over my shoulder, and took one last look around the park. It was just another night in the city, but it felt like the beginning of something new. I didn't know what was next, but I knew I was ready for it. As I walked away, the city lights reflecting off the pavement, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my heart. Life would continue to throw challenges my way, but I had the strength to face them. I had rediscovered my passions, reconnected with the people who mattered, and found peace in the most unexpected of places. And with that peace came a simple, profound truth. I was free. The future was unwritten, but I had the pen in my hand, ready to start the next chapter. Whatever it brought, I would meet it with an open heart and a song on my lips, knowing that I had come through the fire stronger and more resilient than before. It was time to live, not in the shadow of the past, but in the light of everything that was still to come. The sun had barely risen when I found myself standing in front of Harmony for what I knew would be the last time. The sign above the door swayed gently in the morning breeze, the familiar logo of the restaurant that had been my life's anchor for so long. Today was the final day of operation before the new owners took over, and as I stood there, a mix of emotions swirled within me, nostalgia, pride, and a touch of sadness. Walking through the door, I was greeted by the familiar scent of fresh bread and coffee. Carla was already there, bustling around the kitchen, prepping for the last service. The staff moved with a quiet efficiency, their usual banter subdued, as if they too felt the weight of the moment. "Morning, Tim," Carla said, looking up from her work. Her smile was warm, but her eyes held a trace of sadness. "Morning," I replied, my voice softer than usual. "Everything ready?" She nodded. "We've got everything covered. It's going to be a full house tonight. Everyone wants to say goodbye." I smiled, though it didn't quite reach my eyes. "That's good. I'm glad people want to celebrate this place one last time." We spent the day preparing the restaurant, ensuring every detail was perfect. The menu was filled with the most beloved dishes, and the tables were set with care, candles flickering softly in the dim light. As the hours passed, I found myself lost in memories of the first night we opened, of the challenges we'd overcome, and of the countless moments of joy and connection that had unfolded within these walls. When the doors opened for dinner service, the restaurant quickly filled with familiar faces, loyal customers, friends, and even a few strangers who had heard the stories of Harmony and wanted to experience it before it was gone. The atmosphere was both celebratory and bittersweet, the clinking of glasses and the hum of conversation underscored by the knowledge that this was the end of an era. As the night went on, I made my way around the room, talking with guests, sharing memories and thanking them for their support over the years. It was overwhelming at times, the kindness, the gratitude, the shared sense of loss. But it was also healing, a reminder that this place had been more than just a restaurant. It had been a community, a safe haven. A place where people could come together and share in the simple joys of good food and good company. Late in the evening, after the final course had been served, and the last of the guests were saying their goodbyes, I found myself back in the kitchen. The staff had finished cleaning up and Carla stood by the door, her expression wistful. "I'm going to miss this place," she said softly. "Me too," I admitted. "But it's time," she nodded, understanding in her eyes. "What's next for you?" I leaned against the counter thinking about the question. "I'm not sure yet. I've got some auditions lined up and I'm thinking about doing some traveling. Maybe I'll write a bit, who knows?" "Whatever you do, you'll be great," she said with a smile. "You've got a lot to offer, Tim." "Thanks, Carla. That means a lot." We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, both of us taking in the last few minutes in this space that had been so important to us. Finally, I took a deep breath and straightened up. "Well, I guess this is it." Carla gave me a quick hug. "Take care of yourself, Tim, and don't be a stranger." "I won't," I promised. As she left, I took one last walk through the restaurant, letting my fingers trail over the polished wood of the tables, the cool surface of the bar, and the soft fabric of the chairs. Every corner held a memory, every detail a story. When I reached the front door, I turned back one last time. The restaurant was quiet now, the candles burned down to the wicks, the tables cleared, and the kitchen spotless. It was as if the place was waiting, ready to be passed on to its new chapter, just as I was ready to begin mine. With a final glance, I locked the door and stepped out into the night. The air was cool, the city alive with the sounds of people and traffic, and the sky above was dotted with stars. I felt a sense of closure, a peace that I hadn't expected. Harmony had been my refuge, my salvation, but it was time to let go. As I walked away, I didn't look back. The future stretched out before me, unknown and full of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited about what might come next. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement as I made my way down the street, my footsteps steady and sure. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew I was ready to face whatever came my way. This was the end of one story, but the beginning of another. And as I turned the corner and disappeared into the night, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that the best was yet to come. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the bustling streets of the city. I had spent the day wandering aimlessly, allowing myself to get lost in the familiar yet ever-changing landscape. There was something liberating about not having a destination in mind, about simply moving with the flow of life. As I turned a corner, I found myself in front of a large convention center. The marquee above the entrance announced the event, Culinary Arts Expo 2024. It was the kind of event that once would have excited me to no end. A gathering of chefs, food critics, and culinary enthusiasts from around the world. But today, I felt only a mild curiosity. Without much thought, I decided to step inside. The air was filled with the mingling scents of various cuisines, and the sound of excited chatter echoed through the expansive hall. Booths lined the walls, each showcasing a different culinary delight, from intricate pastries to sizzling meats. As I walked through the expo, I couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia. This world had once been mine, a place where I felt at home, where I had poured all my passion and creativity. But now it felt like a different life, a chapter that had been written and closed. I was about to leave when something caught my eye. At the far end of the hall, a crowd had gathered around a demonstration kitchen, where a tall figure was expertly preparing a dish. There was a buzz of excitement in the air, and as I got closer, I realized why. It was Jason. He hadn't changed much. Still the same confident posture, the same effortless charm that had once captivated Laura and so many others. He moved with precision, his hands a blur as he plated the final dish. The crowd erupted in applause, and Jason flashed a winning smile before stepping back to let the audience take photos of his creation. I felt a rush of emotions, anger, resentment, even a flicker of jealousy. But beneath it all there was something else, something I hadn't expected. Pity. Jason was still at the top of his game, still adored by the public, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trapped in the same cycle, chasing the same hollow victories. As the demonstration ended, the crowd began to disperse and Jason stepped down from the stage. For a moment I considered leaving, slipping away before he could notice me. But something held me back. This was the man who had unknowingly set me on a path of transformation, who had been both the catalyst for my pain and the reason I had found my way back to myself. I stood there watching as Jason moved through the crowd, shaking hands and posing for photos, and then, as if sensing my gaze, he looked up and our eyes met. There was a brief flicker of recognition in his eyes, followed by something else, surprise, maybe even a hint of unease. He hesitated, then began to make his way toward me. "Tim," he said when he finally reached me, his voice laced with uncertainty. "It's been a while." "Yeah," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "It has." We stood there for a moment, an awkward silence hanging between us. I could tell he was trying to gauge my mood, trying to figure out if I was still the same man he had once known, or if I had changed. "How have you been?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "I've been good," I said, and it was the truth. "A lot has happened since we last saw each other." He nodded, as if unsure of what to say next. "I heard about your restaurant, Harmony, right? I'm sorry to hear you're closing it, but it was time," I replied simply. It served its purpose. Jason seemed to relax a little, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Well, if you ever want to get back into the game, there's always a place for you. I know a lot of people who'd be eager to work with you." I shook my head, a small smile playing on my lips. "Thanks, but I'm done with that chapter. I've got other things I want to focus on now." He looked at me, genuinely curious. "Like what?" I shrugged. "Music for one. I've been getting back into it, performing here and there. And maybe some writing. I'm not really sure yet, but I'm excited to find out." Jason studied me for a moment, as if trying to understand this new version of me. Then he nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm glad you found something that makes you happy." "Yeah," I said, feeling a surprising sense of closure. "I am." We stood there for a moment longer. Two men who had once been entangled in a web of betrayal and pain were now just two people who had moved on with their lives. There was no animosity, no lingering resentment, just a quiet understanding that we had both changed, that we were both moving forward in our own ways. "Well," Jason said, breaking the silence, "I should get back. It was good seeing you, Tim." "You too," I replied, and I meant it. As he turned to go, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The anger, the bitterness, it was all gone. Jason was just a man, flawed like the rest of us, doing his best to navigate the twists and turns of life. And I was no longer defined by what had happened between us. I was free. I watched as he disappeared into the crowd, the applause of his fans echoing behind him. And then, without a second thought, I turned and walked away, stepping out into the cool evening air. The city was alive with possibility, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. I had closed the circle and faced the man who had once been my adversary, and in doing so, I had finally let go of the past. There was nothing left to hold me back now. The future was mine, and I was ready to embrace it, whatever it might bring. The next morning, I woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. It was a peaceful kind of awakening, the kind that makes you feel like the world is quietly inviting you to take your time, to savor the moment. I lay there for a few minutes, listening to the city come alive outside my window, feeling the gentle rise and fall of my breath, and allowing myself to just be. Eventually I got up and made my way to the kitchen, where I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the small table, looking out at the world below. The events of the previous day played through my mind, my encounter with Jason, the unexpected sense of closure I had felt, the realization that I was truly ready to move on. There was no longer any lingering bitterness, no desire for revenge. I had let it all go. As I sipped my coffee, I found myself thinking about the future. For so long, my life had been defined by what had happened to me, by the betrayal, the pain, the drive to prove myself. But now, for the first time, I felt free to define my life on my own terms, to create something new, something that was entirely mine. After breakfast, I picked up my guitar, the one that had been with me through so much, and settled into the chair by the window. I began to play, letting the music flow through me, not thinking too much about the notes or the chords, just feeling them. It was a melody that had been forming in my mind for a while, a song that reflected the journey I had been on, the lessons I had learned, and the peace I had finally found. The lyrics came naturally, almost as if they had been waiting for me to find the right moment to bring them to life. They spoke of loss and recovery, of finding strength in unexpected places, of letting go and moving forward. It wasn't a song about revenge or anger, it was a song about growth, about resilience, about the beauty of rediscovering who you are after everything else has been stripped away. As I played, I felt something shift within me, a sense of completion, of wholeness. This song was the final piece of the puzzle, the culmination of everything I had been through. And as the last notes faded into the air, I knew it was time to share it with the world. That evening, I made my way to a small, intimate venue downtown, a place where local musicians often gathered to perform. It was the kind of place where people came not just to be entertained, but to really listen, to connect with the music and with each other. I had played here a few times before, and tonight felt like the perfect opportunity to return. The room was dimly lit, the air filled with the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. I took a seat at the bar, waiting for my turn to go on stage, and watched as the other musicians performed. There was a sense of camaraderie in the room, a shared understanding that music was more than just entertainment. It was a way of expressing the things that words alone couldn't convey. When my name was called, I made my way to the stage, guitar in hand. The lights were soft and warm, and as I sat down on the stool and adjusted the microphone, I felt a calm settle over me. I wasn't nervous or anxious, I was simply ready to share what I had created. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady. "This song is something new, something that's been with me for a while, but it's only now found its way into the world. I hope it resonates with you as much as it has with me." With that, I began to play, the familiar melody filling the room, the lyrics flowing naturally. As I sang, I felt a deep connection with the audience, not just as a performer, but as someone who had walked a difficult path and come out the other side stronger, more whole. The song was my story, but it was also theirs, a shared experience of loss and recovery, of finding light in the darkness. When I finished, there was a moment of silence before the room erupted in applause. It wasn't the loud, frenzied applause of a big concert, it was something more meaningful. A genuine appreciation for the music, for the honesty and vulnerability that had gone into creating it. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me as I stood and bowed. This was what I had been searching for, not fame or recognition, but a sense of connection, of knowing that my music had touched others in some small way. After the show, as I packed up my guitar, a few people came up to me to share their thoughts on the song. Their words were kind and heartfelt, and I could see that they meant something to them. It was a reminder that music has the power to heal, to bring people together, to make sense of the things we often struggle to understand. As I left the venue and stepped out into the cool night air, I felt lighter than I had in years. The city was quiet now, the streets mostly empty, and as I walked home, I found myself humming the melody of the song I had just played. Life was still full of uncertainties, challenges, and unexpected twists. But I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I had faced my past, let go of my anger, and found peace within myself. And now, I was ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing that I had the strength and resilience to face it head on. The journey wasn't over, but I was no longer walking in the shadow of what had been. I was moving forward with a song in my heart and a newfound sense of purpose. And as I looked up at the stars twinkling in the night sky, I knew that the best was yet to come. The end of one story had given birth to another, and this time, I was writing it entirely on my own terms.